My beloved brothers and sisters, if you are hearing these words, it means I have gone home to the Father. I speak to you now not as a pope, but as a man who has lived, prayed, struggled, and hoped just like you. I have felt the weight of my human imperfections, and the boundless mercy of God. From this place of humility, I must share something that has long stirred in my heart, a truth I could no longer keep silent. This world, for all its beauty, carries a deep wound, a spiritual sickness spreading quietly like smoke in a closed room. I have seen this sickness in the corridors of power. Even within our church, I have heard the cries of the innocent, the exploited, the forgotten, and I have carried the burden of secrets, things whispered behind cathedral walls, things too terrible to ignore. I ask not for fear but for awakening. The truth must purify us, even if it shakes us. Let my final words not be of condemnation but of clarity, and may what I reveal now be received with courage, prayer, and above all, love. There is a truth few dare speak within the church, for 'tis not of God but of man's ambition, of pride, of corruption, have sought to distort the light of Christ. These verses worked in shadows, wearing holy garments while hiding unholy intentions. I have spent many nights in prayer, asking for the strength to confront them. Sometimes I failed. Sometimes I was silent too long. There are documents, buried deep, naming those who betrayed their vows. There are victims whose voices were muffled by gold and power. Some of these voices came to me quietly, trembling, and I wept with them. Others never made it. I carry them in my prayers still. I speak now because silence can become complicity, and I cannot go to my rest with a quiet heart if I do not confess this final truth. My brothers and sisters, the church must cleanse itself not with wrath but with repentance. We must return to the gospel, know the structures, not the politics, but the cross, the living Christ. If I have disappointed you, forgive me. If I have loved you, remember me not as a pope, but as a sinner who longed for the light. Pope Francis spoke with a trembling but steady heart, revealing what he had long held in prayer. Within the church, very institution entrusted to carry the light of Christ to the world, there were hidden shadows. These were not whispers of sin from the outside world, but from within the very walls that should have been most sacred. He did not speak these words to shame nor to provoke outrage, but because silence had become unbearable. For too long, he had watched as ambition, pride, and the thirst for power had crept into the hearts of men who once knelt in solemn vows. They wore the robes of priests, bishops, and even cardinals, but some were not shepherds. They were wolves in disguise. He had seen it in the quiet reshuffling of files, the sudden retirements, the unexplained silences when questions were raised. He spoke of rooms filled with incense and politics, where prayer was often replaced with strategy, where suffering was minimized for the sake of reputation. And most painfully, he admitted there were times when he knew more than he let on. There were false real ones, documents, testimonies, names. Some he had read with shaking hands, others were kept from him until too late. He carried the guilt not only of what had happened but of what had not been done in time. His voice cracked as he spoke of the victims' children, the vulnerable, the silenced. He said he remembered their faces in prayer, especially at night when the palace halls were quiet and conscience grew loud. Some had come to him in secret, their stories scarred with pain. Some he could help, others he could only weep for. And now, at the end of his earthly pilgrimage, he said their voices cried louder than ever before in his soul. He did not name names in this moment. He did not speak with anger but with sorrow. He asked for forgiveness, not just from God but from the people. He pleaded that the church not be hated for the sins of a few but also admitted must no longer hide those sins to protect its image. The image of the church, he said, is not the buildings, not the power, not the pageantry. It is Christ crucified, and Christ did not hide the wounds showed them. So must the church, with a heavy heart. Pope Francis turned inward and spoke of his own humanity, not with pride but with deep humility. He acknowledged that there were moments when he failed to speak, when he chose silence not out of malice but out of fear, uncertainty, or even hope that time would heal what silence could not. He confessed that the weight of the papacy, though carried with faith, often pressed heavily upon his conscience. There were decisions made in quiet rooms, conversations behind closed doors, where he felt the tension between mercy and justice, between protecting the church and confronting the truth, and in some of those moments, he faltered. He did not blame others for these silences. He did not make excuses. He admitted that in his heart, he often knew more than he publicly revealed. He was told to wait, to be cautious, to avoid scandal, and sometimes he listened to those voices, even when another voice of Christ called him to act with greater courage. He confessed to those listening that the hardest moments in his papacy were not the public challenges, but the quiet battles of conscience, the tears shed in prayer, the sleepless nights, the letters read and reread, knowing that behind each one was a soul longing for justice or peace. Pope Francis shared that many came to him in desperation, whistleblowers, survivors, even clergy who had lost faith in the integrity of the system. He listened to them, and he carried their pain with him. Yet still, there were times when he remained still. He believed then that patience might be a virtue, that healing might come through gentle reform. But now, standing at the edge of eternity, he saw that the silence only prolonged the wound. The church, he said, cannot be healed by what it refuses to face. He asked for forgiveness, not as a final act of self-defense, but as a sincere plea from a soul who had tried to serve God as best he could, yet sometimes fell short. He said, "I was not always the Peter the world needed. Sometimes I was only Simon, the man still learning to walk in faith." In that moment, his voice softened. He reminded the faithful that even Peter denied Christ 3 times, yet Christ still built the church upon him. "May my failures," he whispered, "become seeds of truth for those who come after me." With deep emotion, Pope Francis began to speak of the ones whose pain had been buried the deepest, those who had been hurt not by the world, but by those they were taught to trust most, members of the church. His voice trembled as he recalled the faces of the victims, not as names and reports but as living souls who had suffered betrayal cloaked in holiness. He remembered the trembling hands, the tearful confessions, the long silences that spoke more than words ever could. These were not distant stories to him. They were personal. They haunted his prayers, followed him in the silence of night, and lingered behind every decision he made. He told of a woman who once came to him, clutching a rosary with fingers that shook. She had been silent for decades, her pain pushed down into the corners of her soul. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but in her trembling voice was the echo of countless others, men and women, children and grown adults who had been harmed, ignored, or pushed aside. Pope Francis said that he would never forget the way she looked at him, not with anger but with a question. Why did no one listen? He confessed that her question pierced his heart in a way few things ever had. And though he had tried to amplify those voices, to bring justice, he admitted that the path was slow and often blocked by others, who valued the institution more than the individual. He said this grieved him more than any worldly criticism, more than any attack on his name or position, because the church was supposed to be a refuge for the wounded, not a source of wounds. He remembered the letters he read, some scrawled in pain, others written with articulate rage, He said he kept some of them in a drawer near his bedside, reading them again and again, asking God how such things had been allowed to happen. He prayed over them, sometimes in tears, sometimes in silence too deep for words. In his final reflection, he said, to those who were silenced, I speak now, I see you, I hear you, I believe you, and I ask your forgiveness, not as a pope, but as a brother who failed to protect you. It was his hope, he said, that the church would finally begin to listen, not just to defend itself, but to change. Pope Francis' voice grew quieter as he spoke of the urgent need for the church to return to its roots, its humble, secret foundation in the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. He shared that over the years, he had come to realize that the church had often become far more focused on its own preservation and institutional strength than on the simple message of love, compassion, and service to the poor that Christ embodied. He admitted, was one of his greatest regrets that the institution had at times placed more emphasis on its wealth, its power, and its status in the world rather than on the gospel that was meant to guide it. He said that in his time as Pope, he had seen the vast divide between the rich and the poor, the powerful and the marginalized. He spoke with sadness of how the church, despite its call to serve those in need, had sometimes turned a blind eye to the suffering of the most vulnerable, focusing instead on its own interests, its own security, and its own position in the world. The poor, the refugees, the homeless, these had too often been treated as a secondary concern, and he saw that the wounds of the church, though hidden behind walls of stone and glass, were not only spiritual but structural. The church had built for itself a kingdom that was far removed from the simple life that Christ had lived, a life marked by poverty, humility, and a radical care for the outcast. He admitted that the failure to confront this deep contradiction was a fault he carried with him. He spoke candidly about how difficult it had been to challenge the entrenched systems of power within the church, systems that over centuries had been built to protect the institution, often at the cost of the very values it was supposed to uphold. He recalled moments when he had tried to reform these structures, only to encounter resistance not from the outside world, but from within the walls of the church itself. And yet, he said, it was clear that the path forward required not just small changes, but a radical transformation, a return to the heart of the gospel. We must go back, he said softly, back to the simple message of Christ. We must strip away all that distracts use or wealth, our power, our desire for influence, and become once again what Christ intended us to be, a people of service, a community of love, a family of the poor. The church must not be a place for the powerful, but for the broken-hearted. The wealthy must open their doors, and the powerful must kneel in service to those who have nothing. He spoke of the need for humility, for the kind of humility that Christ displayed when he washed the feet of his disciples, when he dined with sinners, when he gave his life for the world. He said that if the church was to have any hope of renewal, it had to reclaim that humility and abandon its obsession with influence and authority. The church, in his final words, must become a church that listens to the cries of the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, a church that offers not judgment but mercy, a church that opens its arms not to the powerful, but to those who are cast aside by society. And with tears in his eyes, Pope Francis spoke directly to those who had long felt abandoned by the church. It is you whom I have failed most. It is you I have let down. But know this: I see you, I hear you, and in my heart, I have always been with you. And the church, if it is to be true to Christ, must stand with you as well. He prayed that the future of the church would be one where the light of the gospel shone brightest among those who needed it most, and where the wounds of the past were healed through sincere repentance, action, and above all, love. Pope Francis' final words were marked by an overwhelming sense of hope and a deep plea for transformation. As he looked back on his life and papacy, he acknowledged that he had not always been the man or the leader the world needed, but he asked for one thing above all: that the church would rise from its imperfections, be a beacon of light and love in a broken world. He spoke with humility, acknowledging that his own shortcomings could never overshadow the profound calling that all Christians share, the calling to follow Christ, to walk in his footsteps, and to carry his message of love and reconciliation into every corner of the world. He reminded the faithful that throughout history, the church had faced many challenges, many failures, and many betrayals, but through it all, the truth of the gospel had never changed. The message of Christ's love, his mercy, his radical acceptance of the poor and the broken-hearted was eternal, and while the church had faltered, Christ had never left it, never abandoned it. The church, he said, must not forget this: that its true strength lies not in its human institutions, its wealth, or its power, but in its deep, abiding connection to the living Christ. It is in the brokenness of humanity that Christ's love is most clearly revealed, and the church must learn to embrace this truth if it is to heal and to fulfill its mission. Pope Francis' heart ached for the wounds the church had inflicted not just upon the victims of abuse and corruption, but upon the very essence of what the church was meant to be. And yet, in his final reflections, he was resolute in his belief that transformation was still possible. The church could and must become what Christ intended it to be: community of mercy, of healing, of radical love and service. But this would require a deep, collective repentance, a willingness to confront the darkness within, and a commitment to rebuilding the church from the ground up. It was not a simple task, nor a quick one, but it was a necessary one. He asked for forgiveness not as a leader who had failed, but as a fellow pilgrim who had walked beside the people of God, struggling with them, learning from them, and sharing in their hopes and their sorrows. His appeal was not just to the hierarchy of the church, but to all the faithful, to the lay people, the priests, the bishops, and the cardinals. All had a part to play in the renewal of the church, and all must be willing to put aside their pride, their self-interest, and their comfort in order to embrace the radical call of the gospel. In his final moments, Pope Francis spoke not with bitterness or regret, but with a profound sense of peace. He had given all he could, and now it was time for others to continue the journey. He prayed that those who would come after him, the future leaders of the church, would be guided by the same love and compassion that had guided him. But more importantly, he prayed that every Christian, regardless of their station in life, would take up the mantle of discipleship with a renewed sense of urgency and love. The church, he said, was never meant to be a fortress of power or a symbol of authority. It was meant to be a hospital for the wounded, a place of refuge for the lost, and a home for all who seek the love of Christ. And with that, his final message was clear: that the work of healing, of renewal, and of true transformation had only just begun. The future of the church was in the hands of every single believer, and the call to live out the gospel with integrity, compassion, and truth was more urgent now than ever.